There is measurable radio frequency field within a small radius of the device, and so if you're carrying it in your pocket, that's where the fields would be measurable. It wouldn't be measurable in your brain. If you're carrying it, if you have it next to your ear, that's where there would be measurable exposure. If you're using it for texting, that's where the measurable exposure would be. Now, it's natural to say, well, could it pose a cancer risk, you know, in your groin, in your hip, on your wherever you carry it? Absolutely. For your fingers? The answer is nobody knows. No one has done any research to address tumors other than brain tumors. Because certainly in the era when these studies were initiated and carried out, the ear was the most common place where cell phones were used. And the energy output is, there's energy output when the device is on, when it's in a receiving mode. But it's greatest when it's in actual use. So when it's actually transmitting signals to the base station, receiving signals from the base station, that's when the antenna is working, and that's when you're getting the detectable radio frequency. My own gut feeling is that the risks would be greatest, if there is a risk, they would be greatest in the area around the ear compared to other areas where one might carry the cell phone. Among other things, because we don't tend to get many tumors spontaneously in those areas of the body where, in proximity to where one carries the cell phones. But one does get tumors spontaneously in the brain. And so whatever carcinogenic effect a device has, it's working on the baseline risk of that kind of tumor. And so if this device doubles the risk of cancer, if it does, I'm not saying it does, it would be much more devastating if it doubles the risk of brain cancers, which are much more common than cancers in, you know, on your hip or something like that, on your skin. Yeah.
And one last question, you spoke about another form of cancer, which was the acoustic neural.
Yeah. Yeah.
Were there any studies?
Yes, there were a few studies on this one, and they were negative. None of them showed any relationship. Yeah.
I know you're not a physicist, but
yeah,
about these things, but I thought I'd ask anyways, just for your opinion. In terms of the radio frequency fields, the intensity of them coming from Wi-Fi in relationship to a cell phone, like I think like a lot of people, through the fog of these numbers, I still have a strong personal intuition. Like I'm very biased, right? But I don't own a cell phone, and I'm terrified of it, and happily a Luddite to that extent. But Wi-Fi I can't get away from, and I'm just wondering if you can, I get the sense I'm being bombarded constantly, and however crazy that may sound, I don't care.
Yeah.
But I guess my question is, I'm wondering if you have any idea on, if you could tell me what, in your opinion, would be the sort of the RF and intensity relationship between just Wi-Fi, as perhaps likely fills this room, and cell phone. Yeah.
I honestly don't know the answer, but I'll guess. I'll guess that that the amount of exposure is greater from the cell phone when it's in use than from background sources like Wi-Fi or even base station communication in the community to other people's cell phone, which is a kind of background noise as well. And from what I understand, even for cell phones, the amount of exposure is extremely variable depending on such features as how far you are from the base station, you know, 1 kilometer or 200 meters or 3 miles, whatever. So that's one determinant. The actual model of phone, different models of phone are configured differently and engineered differently and have different power outputs. The angle at which the phone is held by the ear, whether you are near concrete or wood or trees or leaves, whether you're in a moving vehicle or stationary, whether there are people standing around you, all of these things influence the radio frequency fields. So it's an extremely complex issue just for cell phones. For Wi-Fi, it might even be an order of magnitude more complicated. One of the things that I understand is, I mean, one of the natural questions is, well, how can you, for cell phones, how can you get away from the exposure? Actually, it's very easy. Use an earpiece. If you have the phone in your hand and what do you call it, a hands-free thing, you know, connected to your ear with an earphone, then the exposure is only in your hand, not with the earphone, because that's where the antenna is. A Bluetooth device in your ear does have some communication power, you know, characteristics. However, just to put it in proportion, the amount of exposure is proportional to how far the device has to go to catch the signal. If you have a Bluetooth in your ear and the phone is in your hand, the Bluetooth has to go about 2 feet to catch the signal. If you have the phone by your ear, the phone has to go about 1 mile or 2 miles to catch the signal from a base station. So that difference in distance gives some idea of the difference in relative exposure that you might get from a Bluetooth device or from using it just as it is, or just using the mechanical, just the cord attached to it. Am I concerned about sort of living in a sea of these kind of radio frequency fields from Wi-Fi? I have a background level, low level of concern about it. I wish we were able to do research on it, and I'm a little bit pessimistic as to whether we will be able to, because it's such a marvelous technology. It would be a shame to throw it out if it weren't dangerous. I mean, think about electricity. If 100 years ago people had started raising the same questions about, you know, electrical current, you know, that it might be dangerous, and there was never any demonstration that it was dangerous, but just someone was concerned about it. It had a sort of a magical quality to it, and magical things have, you know, mysterious things could be dangerous. They could have said at the time, well, you know, it hasn't been proven to be safe, so let's not get into electricity. Well, let's, you know, have gas lighting, and maybe, I mean, this library would be a lot more charming if there were candlesticks and instead of these lights, but it's still quite charming as it is. But, you know, that's the way I feel about it.
Just clarify just about the Bluetooth. Yeah. You say the Bluetooth is, then the cell phone is safer than the Bluetooth in your ear?
Yeah.
So the Bluetooth is more dangerous, if there's any danger, than a cell phone itself in your ear?
No, sorry. It's the reverse. The Bluetooth is hardly any exposure. So the cell phone has, you know, I'll say 100 units of exposure. Right. The Bluetooth has 1 unit of exposure, and if you attach a cord to the thing and put it in your ear, that has 0 units of exposure.
So what about the distance between the Bluetooth and the cell phone and the cell phone and the base station? I don't understand.
Yeah, so the exposure, when you're using a Bluetooth, there's still exposure where the cell phone antenna is. So in your hand, on the desk, wherever you keep, in your car, on a little gizmo, wherever the cell phone is, there's exposure. that's going a mile away to catch a signal. The cell phone to the Bluetooth, trivial, very, very much less. Not zero, but much, much less. Yeah.
I was wondering what role, if any, the cell phone makers have in this kind of research, and whether, I mean, I'm doubtful that they're.
Sorry, you are.
Doubtful that they're helpful.
Yeah.
But, I just wonder if you can speak.
Yeah. I'm not aware. Well, okay. The Danish cohort study that I described was carried out using the lists of cell phone subscribers in Denmark. It could not have been done without the collaboration of the cell phone companies. They could not have known what the cancer experience of their subscribers would be for the next 10 years, so there's no way they could have biased or tainted or done anything nefarious to that study. I'm not aware of other studies that I described how they were funded. I am aware of how the Interphone study was funded. The Interphone study had probably about 25% funding from the cell phone industry in Europe. And the reason for this is because they've got the money. It's the same as, is it Willie, what's the guy's name? There was a famous bank robber in the 1930s called Willie Mitchell or something. And he got arrested, and the journalist asked him, why did you rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money was. I mean, it's a little bit like that. You know, getting money for these kind of big research projects is not, you know, it's not, you know, we want to do a study, it's an important subject, give us $20 million. It doesn't happen like that. So you've got to put together sort of different ways of, you know, putting together a bunch of money. Now, the money that was obtained from the European cell phone industry actually only contributed to the infrastructure of the study, not to the parts that were carried out in the different centers. So that my part in Montreal, for example, was only funded through a national Canadian research funding council called the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, which funds academic research like the Canada Council does for arts and so on. The study could not have been done without that money. The money was negotiated through an organization called l'Union Internationale contre le Cancer. It's a cancer, an anti-cancer agency that's been around for over 50 years, based in Geneva, that is sort of universally respected and recognized as, you know, as a clinical and public health agency. Their lawyers negotiated with the cell phone industry in such a way that the industry paid their contribution and had no access to the data, to the researchers, to the subjects, to the publications, to any of the material before the rest of the world did in publications. So I think that for me is the ideal way of doing research. I think industries that are large and that are under some cloud of suspicion should actually be responsible to pay part of the costs of the research into the products that they produce. And the mechanism that was set up had such firewalls that they were unable, even if they had wanted to, and I'm not aware that they ever tried to influence the way the research was carried out. Yeah, Elsa.
I have a question about risk perception. Because I mean, if you think about known carcinogens like asbestos or like tobacco, I mean, you kind of have some symptoms as you're developing health problems, right? You have a cough or you have pain in your chest or something. And I'm thinking about like cell phones. I mean, certainly, you know, there's heat from cell phones, and you know, some people might get headaches, you know, from using cell phones. So I wonder if these contribute to a perception of risk associated with these devices.
I guess they might contribute to a perception of risk, and I guess also the kind of anecdotes that I described at the beginning of, you know, there are a lot of people who use cell phones, and there are a lot of people, unfortunately, who get brain cancer, and sometimes the two are going to meet. Sometimes you're going to get people with brain cancer getting tumors, even if there's no causal association. But when it happens to someone, and they, you know, it's natural to wonder, and if enough people are wondering, you get a sort of a snowball effect. The kind of the heat production, that's one of the mechanisms that has been discussed and debated as to whether this could be part of a carcinogenic process, but that has been pretty much dismissed by the basic science research. But in terms of what you're asking about, the risk perception, I'm not sure what leads to the perception of risk. I think that, you know, the mysteriousness of this device is part of the constellation of things that leads to suspicion. You know, this amazing thing, you hold it here and you hear someone, you can walk around with it and so on. It's quite miraculous for someone in my generation, at my age. I still find it miraculous. I mean, most of you guys take it for granted, but I think that probably does contribute to some extent to suspicion or whatever. But I don't know if you have any other ideas of what.
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Like I use. I'm sorry, I have to jump into
Yeah.
this. I don't mean to prolong the evening, but like I don't. You know, we're a couple. I don't have a cell phone. I would never want to have one. She has a cell phone. Now and then I use it. And as crazy as it may sound, day after day, week after week, I don't use a cell phone. But when I do use her cell phone or anyone's, I swear I can feel the difference after.
Yeah.
I really believe that I can. For sure, that could be the psychosomatic thing, you know, that's going on. But
no, but and that could very well be real. But not everything that gives you headaches gives you cancer.
Yeah.
And you know, cancer is a very specific process. Headaches, discomfort, all of that is perfectly reasonable. I don't like using a cell phone, actually. I don't like the physical sensation myself. I prefer to use, anyways, I prefer to use a landline any day over a cell phone, just in terms of comfort and not to mention the quality of the sound. But that discomfort is not in itself a demonstration of other biological phenomena.
Just very quickly,
Yeah.
I don't mean to belabor the point. I just want to very, very briefly bring up again what I brought up earlier, which I don't think you addressed, maybe because the studies didn't address it. To me, it seems like if somebody's using a cell phone for 10 hours a day, constantly, it would be different than if somebody's using a cell phone once every 2 or 3 days for 2 hours.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like any of the studies address that. And my second point is, I think, from what you said as far as long-term studies, should there be a study every decade? Like right now, we're in the throes of a new study, like at the beginning of every decade, so then we can see the progression and the studies will be more accurate.
Yeah. In terms of your initial question, in the interphone study, we did look at the patterns, the risks in terms of patterns of usage, short, intense versus long-term, lower level. And the answer was not clear, actually, as to whether there's more risk doing it, you know, taking that highest decile of users and dividing them into the ones who have the high intensity but for a shorter period versus lower intensity over a longer period, we didn't see a clear difference in risk. It doesn't mean that there wasn't one. The numbers got smaller and it got harder to see a pattern, but we looked for it and we didn't see it. In terms of your second question, I agree with you wholeheartedly this kind of research is difficult to do, and it's getting more difficult. And it's not only the question of cell phone, it's all environmental agents, whether it's air pollution, whether it's genetically modified food, whether it's breast implants, whatever concerns people have in society about possible risks of behaviors or environments, it's getting harder to do that research for multiple reasons. One of them is the increasingly difficult sort of ethics, legal constraints that we are under. It's harder to do the research in a proper, scientifically defensible way. And actually, the kind of expertise to do this research, the epidemiological expertise, believe it or not, is declining. There's been a tremendous increase in biomedical research all over the world, in Canada, US, and so on, propelled by the genetics revolution, the genome and all that stuff. And scientists are like kids in a toy store. They love that stuff. It is so much fun to play with these things. Most of it is useless, but you are paying for it through your taxes. There are armies of scientists in their labs doing this stuff. There's no one around anymore, very few people around anymore, who have the capability of doing this kind of research. There are fewer and fewer students going into this area. It's not as sexy to do this kind of research as it is to go into a lab and look for the gene that causes breast cancer. That sounds like, that's what's grabbing people. That's where the money is. That's where the funding agencies want to go. That's where pharmaceutical industry wants the researchers to go. It's where the government departments of commerce want the researchers to go, and the universities to go. So that's what's happening on the research capacity side. And I'm a bit discouraged about that because, my kids and their kids and so on, we're not going to know about the dangers of things in our daily lives. We might not have discovered the relations between sunlight and skin cancer, between HPV and cervical cancer, between smoking and lung cancer. All of these things were discovered with research like this. The number of people who are able to do this and who are doing it is declining in absolute terms. So,
your job is in jeopardy as well?
My job is not in jeopardy at all. And I mean, I'm well funded, but I'm at the end, closer to the end of a career than at the beginning of a career. I'm not going to produce a lot more research like this. And so but I mean, personally, I'm very well funded. I don't have a problem. A cynical point of view is that the sort of scientific power structure uses people like me as sort of tokens, let's throw a few crumbs in this direction so that it'll pacify them and people will think that something's being done in that area. That's not for quotation.